She thought it was just another ordinary walk home, until the screech of tires and the rough hands of strangers shattered her world. Fear clutched her chest as the thugs tried to drag her into a dark car, their voices cold and merciless. Her cries echoed into the night, desperate and unanswered, until the sudden roar of engines cut through the silence. From the shadows, a biker gang appeared, their headlights blazing like guardians of justice. What happened next would not only save her life but change everything she thought she knew about courage, loyalty, and the power of unexpected protectors. The night air was cool, carrying with it the faint hum of distant traffic and the rustle of leaves stirred by a passing breeze. She pulled her jacket tighter around herself, her steps steady but quick along the dimly lit street. It was late, much later than she intended to be out, and though she told herself it was fine, a small unease had already begun to grow inside her. The kind of unease a woman knew too well, the instinct that whispered when shadows felt heavier than they should, when the silence seemed almost too expectant. Her phone was dead, leaving her cut off from the thin lifeline of comfort. She told herself she was just imagining things, just being cautious. But then she heard it, the low growl of an engine rolling slowly behind her. She turned her head slightly, trying not to be obvious, and saw the dark outline of a car creeping along the curb. Its headlights were dimmed, almost as if the driver didn't want to draw attention. Her heart gave a sharp thud, but she kept walking, faster this time, pretending she hadn't noticed. The car stopped just a few feet ahead of her, the doors opening with a sharp metallic click. Two men stepped out, their silhouettes broad and menacing under the flickering street lamp. She froze for a fraction of a second, instinct urging her to run, but her body heavy with fear. One of the men smirked, his voice casual in a way that made her skin crawl. "Hey, sweetheart, where you headed all alone this late?" His words were laced with something darker than politeness, his eyes glinting with a predator's intent. Before she could react, the second man moved quickly, closing the distance between them with long, confident strides. Her breath hitched as his hand shot out, gripping her arm with a force that made her wince. "Come on," he muttered, tugging her toward the waiting car. She twisted, struggling to break free, her voice cracking as she cried out, "Let go of me. Leave me alone." The night swallowed her words, and the empty street gave her no answer. Panic flooded her veins, her mind racing for escape. Her feet kicked against the pavement, her nails clawing at the man's grip, but he only tightened his hold, laughing low under his breath as though her fear amused him. The other man opened the back door of the car, the dark interior yawning open like a cage waiting to swallow her whole. Her chest tightened with terror. She knew that once she was inside, her chances of escape would shrink to nothing. She fought harder, thrashing, screaming louder now, desperation sharpening her voice. But the men weren't fazed. They shoved, pulled, overpowered. Just as the one dragging her tried to shove her closer to the car door, the night was ripped apart by a sound that sent a shiver racing through the air, a deep, thunderous roar of engines, growing louder with every heartbeat. At first, she didn't understand, but then she saw the glare of lights emerging at the far end of the street. The rumble grew into a deafening chorus, and the thugs paused, turning their heads. From the darkness, a line of motorcycles came into view, their headlights cutting like blades through the night, their engines snarling with raw power. The man holding her hesitated, his grip faltering just slightly as the reality of what was approaching registered. She stumbled back, pulling against his loosening grasp, her wide eyes fixed on the sight before her. The biker gang advanced like an unstoppable tide, their leather jackets gleaming, chains rattling, helmets catching the dim glow of street lamps. The ground itself seemed to tremble beneath their arrival, the overwhelming sound pressing down on the street with authority. The men exchanged a glance, their earlier arrogance cracking into something else, uncertainty, even fear. One of the bikers revved his engine louder, breaking formation as they circled closer, tightening the ring around the thugs and their car. Within seconds, the predators who moments ago thought they had power were trapped, caught inside a circle of steel and fury. The leader of the gang pulled forward, his massive bike stopping just feet away. He lifted his helmet, revealing a weathered face etched with scars and eyes that burned with fierce intent. He didn't need to raise his voice for it to carry weight. "Let her go." The words rumbled like thunder, calm yet deadly serious. The thug who held her tried to mask his nerves with bravado, shoving her roughly behind him as if she were some kind of bargaining chip. "Mind your own business," he barked, though his voice cracked slightly. "This doesn't concern you." A slow, humorless smile spread across the biker leader's face, his gaze never leaving the man's. He leaned slightly forward on his bike, his voice dropping into something darker. "Everything on this street concerns us." The gang around him revved their engines in unison, the sound so loud it rattled windows, making the air itself vibrate. The message was clear. The thugs were outnumbered, outpowered, and completely trapped. She clutched her arms around herself, her breathing ragged, still trembling with the aftermath of terror, but as she looked around at the circle of protectors, a strange, overwhelming relief began to push against her fear. The thug finally shoved her aside, releasing her from his grip. She stumbled backward, her knees weak, but a biker nearest to her gently caught her arm, steadying her. His leather gloves were rough, but his touch careful, protective. He gave her a nod that silently said, "You're safe now." The leader dismounted his bike, the heavy boots striking the pavement as he strode toward the men. Without hesitation, he grabbed the thug by the collar, pulling him close enough that the smaller man visibly trembled. "You think you can snatch women off the street?" His voice was low, but every word cut like steel. "Not here. Not tonight." The second thug muttered something under his breath, trying to edge toward the car, but the bikers closed in tighter, blocking every possible exit. One of them kicked the car door shut with a heavy boot, the sound slamming like a final warning. What happened next blurred in her memory: the shouting, the growl of threats, the desperate attempts of the thugs to wriggle free of the noose tightening around them. She remembered the flash of fists, the crunch of boots on gravel, the cries of pain that spilled into the night. She flinched, turning her face away, but she couldn't escape the truth of what was happening. The hunters had become the prey. When silence finally fell again, the bikers stood tall, the thugs slumped and broken, stripped of the power they once flaunted. The leader gestured for his men to drag the car keys away, tossing them into a storm drain with a flick of his wrist. Then he turned back to her. "You okay?" he asked, his tone softening now, almost gentle. She nodded shakily, though her voice caught in her throat before she could form words. Tears welled in her eyes, not just from fear but from the sheer whiplash of emotions, the terror of being powerless and the sudden relief of being saved. The leader gave a small nod, then motioned to one of his men to walk her to safety. As they guided her away, engines roaring back to life behind them, she cast one last glance over her shoulder. The gang stood in the street like guardians carved from iron, their presence filling the night with an unshakable sense of justice. She knew she would never forget the sound of their arrival, the moment when her cries had been answered not by silence, but by the thunder of engines that tore the darkness apart and delivered her from a fate too terrible to imagine. Her hands were still trembling when the thug's grip finally released her, but the echo of his rough fingers around her wrist seemed burned into her skin. Her body shook with the remnants of panic, and though she stood only a few steps away from the car that had nearly swallowed her, the ground beneath her feet felt alien, like she wasn't standing in her own life anymore. The headlights from the bikers' motorcycles still glared, casting long, jagged shadows across the pavement, and she realized the balance of power had shifted completely. Just seconds ago she had been a helpless victim, dragged toward a fate she couldn't bear to imagine, but now the predators were the ones cornered, trapped by a wall of roaring engines and steel. The gang's leader didn't move quickly. He didn't have to. His presence was enough to command silence and attention. He walked toward the thugs with the weight of someone who had long ago stopped needing to prove himself. Each step he took was measured, his boots echoing against the street with a kind of quiet menace. The two men who only moments earlier had laughed at her cries now looked like shadows of themselves, their bravado shrinking as the circle of bikers tightened around them. Their shoulders twitched, their eyes darted for escape, but there was none. She could see it in their faces, the realization that they had made a mistake too big to undo. They were just men, ordinary in their cruelty, but the bikers were something else entirely. They weren't just a gang. They were a storm, a force that seemed to bend the night itself around them. One revved his engine just enough to send a vibration crawling up the pavement, rattling the car door. The thugs flinched, and she almost wanted to laugh at the irony. A minute ago, she had been the one trembling like that, weak and desperate, and now it was them. The leader stopped in front of the thug who had grabbed her. Without a word, He seized the man's collar, yanking him forward until their faces were inches apart. The thug tried to twist free, but the leader's grip was iron, his scarred knuckles pale with strength. "You like dragging women into cars?" he asked softly, almost conversationally, but the weight in his tone was more terrifying than if he had shouted. The thug swallowed hard, sweat beading on his temple. "We weren't," he began, but the leader cut him off with a sharp tug that made the man stumble. "Don't lie to me." The words came out like gravel, and the rest of the gang growled their engines in unison, a chorus of mechanical thunder that made her chest tighten. It was a sound that filled the air with power, with warning, and she knew it wasn't for her. It was for them, the men who had thought they could take what wasn't theirs. The other thug tried to step forward, puffing up his chest like he still had some control left. "We don't want trouble," he said quickly, his voice higher now, betraying his fear. "We were just..." But he faltered when the bikers nearest to him rolled forward, hemming him in. The glow of their headlights painted his face in harsh light, revealing every twitch of nerves, every flicker of regret. One biker leaned close, his helmet hiding his expression but his words dripping with contempt. "Then why were you shoving her into that car?" His voice was sharp, echoing in the tense silence. The thug didn't answer. His jaw worked, his eyes darted toward the car as if the open door could still save him, but another biker slammed it shut with the heel of his boot. The slam rang out like a gavel's strike, final and undeniable. She stood frozen, hugging her arms around herself, watching the scene unfold as if she were outside of her own body. Part of her wanted to run, to escape before the violence boiled over, but another part of her couldn't look away. She needed to see what happened, needed to know that justice, if that's what this was, would be carried out in front of her eyes. Her heart still raced, her throat still ached from screaming, but the fear that had once dominated her was shifting into something else. It was awe. The leader finally released his grip on the thug's collar, only to shove him backward with such force that the man nearly stumbled to the ground. The gang didn't pounce. Not yet. They didn't have to. Their control wasn't in brute force but in the certainty that they owned the moment. The thugs knew it, too. Their shoulders sagged, their defiance drained, and all that was left was the raw truth. They had been caught, and there would be no escape. The leader turned his gaze toward her then, his eyes softer now, searching. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his tone stripped of the menace it had carried seconds before. For a moment she couldn't answer. Her throat was dry, her voice caught somewhere between a sob and a word. She shook her head quickly, her hair falling into her face. I'm okay," she whispered, though the tremor in her voice betrayed the truth of how shaken she was. He gave her a single nod, then looked back at the men. His jaw tightened, his expression hardening once more. "You're lucky we showed up when we did," he said coldly, his voice directed at the thugs but loud enough for her to hear every syllable. "Because if we hadn't, you'd be facing more than just us tonight." One of the bikers barked out a laugh, a sound sharp and humorless. Another spat on the pavement near the thug's boots, a silent declaration of disgust. The gang shifted, the engines revving again, and for a moment the thugs looked like they might collapse under the pressure, their knees buckling with the weight of fear. And then the violence came. It wasn't drawn out, wasn't theatrical. It was swift, merciless, and final. A fist cracked across a jaw, a boot met a ribcage, a body slammed against the hood of the car with a metallic thud that echoed into the night. She flinched at every sound, her stomach twisting, but she couldn't look away. The power dynamic had flipped entirely, and though she should have been horrified, part of her felt a fierce, guilty satisfaction at watching the men who had terrified her only moments ago reduced to nothing. When it was over, the thugs lay crumpled, groaning and broken, their arrogance shattered as thoroughly as their bodies. The gang stood over them, breathing steady, unshaken. The leader crouched down beside the man who had dragged her, gripping his hair to force his head up. "Remember this," he said quietly, his words sharp as glass. "You ever touch another woman again, you'll wish we were the ones who found you. Because there are worse things than us out there." The thug whimpered, nodding weakly, and the leader shoved him down. The bikers backed away then, giving the men space to crawl back toward their car, humiliated and beaten. One biker kicked the keys into the gutter with deliberate care, ensuring their escape wouldn't be quick. The leader turned back to her, his eyes steady, the fire of his anger dimming to something steadier, more protective. "You're safe now," he said, and this time she believed him. She nodded, though tears welled in her eyes, finally spilling over as the adrenaline that had carried her this far began to fade. One of the bikers, younger and less intimidating than the rest, stepped forward and gently offered her his jacket. She accepted it with trembling hands, pulling it tightly around her shoulders, the leather warm and heavy. It smelled of oil and smoke and something strangely comforting: safety. They didn't ask for thanks. They didn't wait for praise. As the engines roared back to life, the gang mounted their bikes, the leader giving her one final nod before pulling his helmet on. And then they were gone, the thunder of their engines fading into the distance, leaving behind only silence and the lingering knowledge that she had been saved by the most unlikely of guardians. She stood alone in the street, her breath ragged, her body weak, but her spirit alight with a single truth. She had stared into the abyss, and when it threatened to swallow her, it was not the law, not a passerby, but a band of outlaws who had pulled her back into the light.